Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana. We're actually taping this show, but it will be aired tonight. So people won't be able to call in, but the information should be really current. It's election season, so it probably will not surprise viewers that we'll be interviewing another candidate who will be on the Green Party line this year. Jeff Russell is running for U.S. Senate. He's run for this office before, and we're going to talk with him about issues that aren't coming up on most of the media programs you're seeing, and also about what it's like to run as a Green. So welcome back, Jeff.
Good to be back, Rana.
One of the reasons I really wanted you to be on the show this year, as well as in a few weeks, Michelle Bicking, our candidate for Congress, is that in contrast with past years, it seems like there are fewer and fewer real debates that are public forums to exchange information.
Issues are not being covered. I mean, the mainstream media is treating all political campaigns like horse races. They only report who's ahead in the polls. I think this is irresponsible, and it is a disservice to we the people. I mean, one of the reasons the press has the staunch protection in the Constitution is because you can't have a democracy without a functioning free press. And unfortunately, our free press is not functioning very much these days.
And I know a frustration that we felt even locally is we want people to vote, but we also want them to be informed about how to vote. And, and it just seems as though it's harder and harder to get the information in a kind of user-friendly way and in a way that really gives you a good idea of the characters and the qualifications and
or even
the ideas of the people who are running.
Or even just the stands on the issues. I mean, you would think that would be first and foremost in a political campaign in a democracy, and it's the hardest thing to get information on. Yeah,
it is. So with that said, you've run a few times for a position that is probably pretty thankless to run for as part of a minor party. There's a lot of money that goes into the federal campaigns from the Republican and Democratic parties. Obviously, the Green Party has always operated on a shoestring. And so why do you think it's important for you to keep on running?
It's important for the same reasons I brought to the State Central Committee in 2010 when I was convinced it would be a good idea for the Greens to support a Senate campaign. It's to have a Green voice in the conversation. We talk about things that the two major parties avoid like the plague. We talk real issues. And these are things that we need to talk about. I mean, climate disruption is not a Chinese conspiracy. It is a clear and present danger. And you know who agrees with me on that? The Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon and the insurance industry. I mean, if you're going to disagree with both of them at the same time, I'm wondering about your sanity.
And Connecticut, as a state that has a big coastline, there is a lot of our state that could be extremely impacted by what is likely to happen over the next 20, 30 years.
And I have been watching Arctic ice and Antarctic ice for a few years now, and things are changing more rapidly than even the United Nations scientists are stating in public. If the melt rates that were happening on the Arctic Ocean in July had continued, we would have had 0 permanent sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. And that opens up a big feedback loop. And feedback loops amplify the effect. Back when I was a kid, more than 90% of the Arctic Ocean was covered by ice, which reflected more than 90% of the solar energy back into space. So I think it was something like 94 or 96%. Let's call it 94. So that 6% of the solar energy was absorbed. With open ocean, 80% of the solar energy is absorbed into the ocean, and another 5 to 10%, somewhere around 7 was what the last, is absorbed by the atmosphere. So we've got an energy budget that's changing from 5% absorption to 85% absorption. That's a lot of energy, that's a lot of heat that stays on the planet and doesn't get reflected into space.
And that could make it change very quickly.
That could. If we had had the changes, if the rate of change had stayed consistent from the beginning of July through August, we could have had a half a foot of sea level rise here in New London before Election Day. You know,
Yeah.
that people would notice that.
People probably would notice that, yes. And so, you know, I know a lot of individuals who are trying to adjust their personal habits to try to do right by the climate. You know, people who are getting electric cars that are powered with solar panels on their roof, as I saw at your place. And I know there are people in New London doing the same thing. People who are, you know, making rain gardens, getting rid of their permeable surfaces. But really, this has to be solved systemically. A lot of individual people are not going to be able to enact the level of change that we need.
As long as we have two parties that are either owned by or kowtow to the corporate interests, we're not going to solve this problem. I shook my head and you know, just, it was fingernails across the blackboard to me when I heard people talk about natural gas being a bridge fuel. That there's less carbon footprint by burning natural gas than there is by burning coal. But that's not the whole picture. One of the biggest problems with fracking is that fracked wells leak a lot more than old technology drilled wells. And if you leak more than something like 6% of the natural gas that comes out of the ground, you are actually doing more climate damage than if you continue to burn coal. I have never heard of a gas field that did not leak at least 5%. I have heard of one that leaked at 19%. That's 1/5, basically, of the methane that's coming out of the ground with the natural gas is escaping into the atmosphere and heating us up. I don't remember how long ago it was, but it was a year and a half. There was a NASA satellite image of a methane cloud that covered 20,000 square miles in the Four Corners region of the United States. And you know, NASA satellites and the infrared technology not only see methane, they identify it. There's no doubt about this. Ground investigations indicated that the most likely source of that 20,000 square mile cloud was leakage from gas wells. We cannot afford to do this anymore. We have got to change on a systemic level. And we've got to stop with subsidies that increase and these unsustainable technologies and start using those resources to do things like put sun tracking solar arrays in the highway medians all over this country. The median, every state has highway median in it, and a lot of these are very large and very wide, and it would be easy to put in either solar arrays or wind turbines that would have a lot less environmental impact than maintaining the coal and gas and oil fired energy generation we have now.
And as you're saying this, I'm thinking, the highway system, the old, what was the Eisenhower Interstate, those are federal roads.
Those are all federal lands, yeah.
So that is something that
could be done on the federal level rather easily.
Right. That would be something that our representatives, senators,
our representatives and our senators
are the ones who could be pushing for that.
Yeah, and why haven't any of them proposed any of that already?
Well, you did mention, and we can get back to climate and other issues as well, but you mentioned the influence of corporate money. And in my view, the one thing that separates the Green Party from all the other parties, including the other minor parties, is that we
refuse to take
that
corporate
money.
donations.
And I think that is the fundamental thing, that within our party we have people who have different views, a variety of views on issues, but the bedrock, I think, is that we represent people and not corporate interests, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, one of the things I learned from a fellow Green, Richard Duffy, is that there was a large push that John D. Rockefeller was behind, according to Richard, to expand the legal rights of corporations. And, we talk about corporate personhood, but the people who invented corporations found out that was a good idea. What is not a good idea is that our legal system has expanded their rights to the point where a corporation has more rights than a flesh and blood human being, and none of the responsibilities. And that was because the Supreme Court in 1904 decided, on the basis of a con job, that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution was intended to extend equal justice under the law to corporate persons, when it clearly was not. The amendment says that all persons born and naturalized shall have equal justice under the law. I have never seen a birth certificate for a corporation. I have never seen naturalization papers for a corporation.
Yeah, incorporation papers look a little different.
Yeah, they have maintained rights and acquired rights that are a detriment to us and our posterity. They are a detriment to our society in general. And one of the things the Romans did right when they made corporations a person, which only means you can bring it into a court of law and sue it. You can hold it legally accountable. That's all corporate personhood means. They said that a corporation's rights extended to only those that were necessary to carry out its chartered functions. And the charter was only valid as long as that purpose was beneficial to the society in general.
So corporations could get penalized even with the death penalty, so to speak.
Oh yeah, you could pull their charter. Imagine if we held that standard today, how many corporations would cease to exist? Because there are so many out there who do not, in any way, shape, or form, perform a chartered purpose that is beneficial to the society in general.
No, and we've kind of, since Citizens United, it's gotten worse in a way because of the money that flows in politics. I think Scott Deschaphy once noted that even talking to our incumbent Congressman Joe Courtney, who is not the worst one in there by any means, but that Representative Courtney admitted that he spends a tremendous amount of his time in office fundraising for the next run. And this just seems wrong. I mean, I think that all candidates should have access to the public airways, and that we should not have this huge glut of advertising that's often deceptive and not equally distributed at all.
Well, I ran for the Green Party in the 1st Congressional District in a year where there was no Senate race. And our congressman there is John Larson, who I consider a personal friend. I've known him for 18 years. And my complaint...
also not the worst guy there.
Yeah, my complaint against John is that he pays more attention to his one biggest constituent, United Technologies, than he does to any other. But, you know, in his defense, that's the way the deck is stacked. That's the way the game is rigged. And we have got to get back to a deck that is not stacked and a game that is not rigged, so, you know, honest people can get into office for the purpose of doing the people's business that is for the people's business, you know, good.
And I think even people who, because of the way the system is, even people who enter with the best of intentions, it is almost corrupting as it is. The first time Joe Courtney ran, he ran against Rob Simmons, and I was supportive of that. He was very strongly in favor of universal health care, to the point that he made a campaign promise that he would not accept congressional health insurance until Congress passed a plan. And he made good on it. His wife, you know, lucky for him, had a job he could get health insurance through, but still, he made good on that. So the Affordable Care Act passed, which wasn't really quite universal health care in some big ways, and I want to talk more about health care.
I want to make a point about the Affordable Care Act, because it follows a pattern that was established either during the Nixon administration or before. The health insurance industry was facing a dilemma in that there was a large, broad support for single payer, which would put them right out of business. Now, they got together with a group of right-wing policy wonks and insurance policy wonks, and they went to a retreat in New Hampshire, and they banged out the foundations for the Affordable Care Act, and they handed it off to Mitt Romney in Massachusetts to see if it would fly.
And that was
one of the biggest provisions of that was that it was going to bail out the health insurance industry. That was its foundational purpose. And when it became national, with very little adjustment, and certainly no adjustment to that foundational purpose, the health insurance industry thrived. And just to show you how systemic this has been, you know, people laud Richard Nixon for passing the Environmental Protection Act. The most important aspect of that was protection for polluting industries. It was getting to the point where the courts were seeing pollution as trespass. And if we allowed the laws of trespass to continue to move into the area of pollution, we would have ended pollution. But the Environmental Protection Act eliminated vulnerability for polluters under trespass law. And that was one of the biggest disservices done to we the people by any federal law I know of.
Well, I think we have seen a trend in certainly the last couple decades of profits being privatized, but costs being commonized or socialized. So,
and common property being sold off. And again, there's a pattern here. I saw the No Child Left Behind as not as something to try and help troubled school systems, but to cripple troubled school systems. And this is the pattern. You know, it starts with underfunding, and then it starts with, oh, there's a problem here, we have to fix it, and the fix actually makes the problem worse. And then said, oh, gee, we can't do this, you know, so we have to privatize it. Yeah. And you know, when it comes to school systems, the funding for education for public education is basically the largest cash flow we have in the United States. And the greedy Republicans and their corporate allies have been sabotaging public schools to justify allowing profiteers to get their hands on that huge revenue stream.
And in all honesty, I mean, Betsy DeVos is a textbook example of maybe the worst of the worst, but Arne Duncan in the Obama administration and at home, Dan Malloy, have not really been friends of adequately funding public education to support it rather than increasing charter schools. So we see this again. Not everyone is equally bad, but there's often not been a commitment to public education, especially in low status parts of the country.
Well, our public education is well, I see so many reports that the results of these standardized testing, high-stakes tests, tell me more about your zip code than anything else.
Absolutely.
They tell me more about the affluence of the community they're taking in than what whether or not the students are succeeding. And another meme maker pointed out that they quoted an educator who said, the scores on these tests tell me about it. To me, give me an impression of Paris that I would get from a map, which is completely irrelevant to the impression of actually being there. These tests are irrelevant, they're immaterial, they're counterproductive, and they are destructive because we're teaching children to prepare for tests that they're never going to take once they're out of school. And
when I worked for Head Start, there were about 2 or 3 years that there were pre and post testing in use in Head Start. It actually was found unconstitutional because they couldn't tell why they were doing these tests. But the idea was to judge how good your program was. So it was a pre-test and a post-test for 4-year-olds. And what I noticed looking at these tests was they were skewed away from city kids. So rural children would do better. The pictures with the vocabulary words, there was a picture of a swamp. It's like, if you...
Gee, there hasn't been a swamp in downtown Hartford in about 150 years.
Yeah, it's like some of the pictures were things that would be in the everyday experience of a rural child, but not the everyday experience of a city kid. And I wondered about it, and I was glad that it was disbanded after a couple of years.
But so many examples of biases like this in everything from the standardized testing that they're doing in schools today to the Stanford Binet intelligence test. So we are human beings. We are the ones who generate these tests. We are flawed. The tests are flawed. And we have to take that into account. When you measure something, you have to know what your yardstick is. And this is one of the things I say to people when I'm talking about economics. I mean, people say we're the richest country in the world. By what yardstick? We have the best health care in the world. By what yardstick? I mean, define your measurement. I mean, people are screaming about the deficit that's being run up in Washington these days, but is the deficit the real enemy? In real economic terms, the best way to measure a deficit is to measure it in terms of percentage of gross domestic product. By that measure, the largest deficit the federal budget ever had was still 1942. And 43, 44, 45, and even 46 were pretty heavy. Now, that's the largest deficit in our history. Is some future generation going to be crushed by that deficit? Well, when? The standard tool of borrowing, if you want to call it borrowing, on the part of the federal government for 150 years, I believe, or something like that, has been the 30-year Treasury bond. Well, let's go 30 years from 1942. That's 1972. So 72, 73, 74, 75, this huge chunk of debt, some of it should have been coming due. My generation should have been crushed by this debt coming due if anyone was going to be crushed. I don't remember paying off that debt being part of the economic problems that were facing us in those years.
And the other thing that frustrates me so much when people talk about high taxes and just look at the budget in terms of raw numbers is you're not looking at what the return is on what your investment is.
That's called economic productivity.
And I really think that it is a mistake to not look at it that way because, talking about the economy, and you mentioned the Green New Deal, it's been shown that federal dollars that go to the defense industry, it does create jobs.
I have a wonderful anecdote for that.
Okay.
When you, and traditionally, defense spending has been the worst when it comes to economic productivity, and here's why. If you spend $10,000 on an artillery shell, which in this day and age is a rather cheap artillery shell, the best you can hope for is you never ever use it for its intended purpose.
Right.
And then you've got to pay to have it secure and safe while you're storing it because it's damn dangerous.
And then you have to pay to dismantle it.
And then when it's no longer serviceable, you have to pay to dismantle. Now, if you spend that $10,000 on a solar array, all of a sudden you're putting 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 watts of electric generation into the power supply. That could, that could power somebody, in their backyard doing some development work on a new widget that all of a sudden makes, something much more energy efficient, which would send ripples through the economy. You get something back for your, the $10,000 you put into that solar array pays itself back in energy that you don't have, not only in energy you don't have to pay fuel for, but in energy that, that cleans up the environment. So, we have got to move away from these economically unproductive investments, which basically means, the defense economy, and moving this money into economically productive investments, environmentally productive investments will make our economy healthier, it will make our citizenry healthier, it'll make the world healthier.
And I'm thinking that there are a lot of people in Southeast Connecticut who work at Electric Boat in that industry, and they're good jobs, they're union jobs, which we want, but if we started shifting even to start with some percent towards the renewable industry, I know there is a kind of exciting wind project in the works.
Yeah, look at the expertise.
It can be transferred.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, the folks at Electric Boat know how water moves. They know how to move through water. Well, one of our oldest forms of industrial energy is hydropower. The water wheels that basically built the Industrial Revolution.
Hey, we have a mill in New London. It's the oldest in the country,
yeah,
I think.
I mean, have these people work on, tidal generation. It's renewable. If you do it intelligently, it has a very low environmental impact. Who's going to be better to extract as much of that energy out of the water than people who have been moving, huge amounts of water for 45, 50 years, well, 70 years now. And United Technologies up in East Hartford, they have been moving things in air. Get them together. Another branch of UTech is Sikorsky in. They know how to make big propellers. Well, you put them together and you're going to have expertise that could make world-beating wind generators. Those people know everything you need to know to design all of that. We can put them to work doing that.
And they could still be good jobs.
And they would be pretty much the same jobs. They might even be better jobs. And you know something, if I were going to work and, you know, jumping on an engine lathe and building a part and saying, you know, all this is going to do is kill somebody, I would not feel so good when I went home Friday afternoon. If I was, you know, at that same engine lathe building a part that's, hey, this is going to go into a wind turbine. Yeah. This is going to help get us off fossil fuel. Yeah. I'd feel a lot better going home Friday afternoon.
Yeah, and I do think that it is really important for people to feel like what they're doing isn't just a paycheck, but is their contribution.
Absolutely. If your work doesn't nourish and your spirit and your psyche, I can't think of anything more depressing. Well, I can, but, you know.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there was a forum at UConn about the potentials of economic conversion away from this, you know, military industry. And one other way that you received a lot of jobs for investment was in the healthcare industry. So we keep hearing who's going to pay for universal health care. Well, you know, if we spent just a fraction of the same dollars we're using for the military spending, we could get a lot of health care for those dollars.
And the thing is, you know, on the federal level, that's not the way to look at it. We have a schizophrenic system in the United States. At the local level, you have to have tax revenue in order to make expenditures. On the state level, you have to have tax revenues to support spending. On the federal level, we have something called monetary sovereignty. And that means that the spending on the federal level is not constrained by dollars, it is constrained by resources. Now, Alan Greenspan was conservative, he was a Republican, and he was a longtime chairman of the Federal Reserve. And one of the aspects of monetary sovereignty is encapsulated in a quote from him. The United States government will never have a problem paying debt denominated in United States dollars, close quote.
So we can print it if we need to.
Yeah, you know, taxation, revenue is not a real economic function of taxation on the federal level. It took me a while to wrap my mind around this, but with the help of, you know, really brilliant people like Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton, I finally got it. On the federal level, the real economic functions of taxation are to support the currency. Stephanie Kelton says that she has hundreds of examples where the money was absolutely worthless until you had to pay your taxes with it. The other function is, as Warren Mosler pointed out, it regulates aggregate demand. So if the economy starts to heat up too much, you increase taxes to damp things down. But the thing is, in relation to personal finance, household finance, corporate finance, municipal and state finance, federal finance is not only the opposite in many instances, it's often counterintuitive. And one of the things we should be teaching our children in public schools is fundamental economics. Because I've seen too many examples of candidates browbeating the constituency with fear-mongering economics that make absolutely no sense when you know what the real story is.
Now, I don't see a whole lot of Senate debates this year either, and I will challenge viewers to even know what Republican is running against Chris Murphy. I had to look it up.
I know him personally.
Oh, Matt Corey?
Yeah, I met him on the campaign trail either 4 years ago or 6, and personally, I like Matt. I will give him this. When he tells you he believes something, it's because he believes it. He has a level of integrity that I find very rare in major party candidates and Republicans in particular. And Matt and I actually have a fairly large realm of agreement on things that we think are wrong with our country and need improvement. We have a much smaller amount of agreement on what we think is the best thing to do about them.
Yeah, that happens.
Yeah, but
frequently.
In this state, in national elections, federal elections, Republicans has very little chance. So there's no horse race, so there's no coverage.
Right, and there are several candidates this year because in addition to Chris Murphy, who I'm guessing most people are just going to assume will win, Matthew Corey, the Republican, Richard Lyon is running on the Libertarian line. They petitioned, and I think they might have a gubernatorial. I actually got a. Yeah. I shouldn't. They have candidates on the gubernatorial line, U.S. Senate line, Secretary of State line, Treasurer and Controller. So the Libertarians made a big push to get a lot of petitions in this year. And of course, there will be a write-in Socialist Action candidate, Fred Link, who did not get on the ballot. And, hearing Fred's story this year sounds so much like some of our Green Party stories from past years. So maybe we should talk a little bit about ballot access and
here in Connecticut, it's incredibly discriminatory. You have to petition and get 1% of the previous election's vote total in valid signatures. Well, that's about 7,500 for the ballot line that Fred Link was after, and he collected 11,000. And there was things that clearly appear to be malfeasance and nonfeasance in the processing of those signatures. People were eliminated because they were unaffiliated voters. No, you can't. They just have to be registered voters. They don't have to be affiliated to have the right to sign a ballot petition. And then once you get on the ballot, as incredibly difficult as they make it here in this state, it's incredibly easy to get thrown off. Ralph Nader got us on the presidential ballot line in 2000. And we lost it 8 years later. Yeah. And then Jill Stein had to come in, and it's expensive. You can't really do that on a volunteer basis. You have to pay professionals to come in and get it done when it's as many signatures as you need for a presidential line or a United States Senate line. Yeah,
and I think 2 years ago when we got Jill Stein on the ballot, we needed that 7,500. I think we ended up turning in almost 16,000. Half were collected by volunteers and half were part of a paid effort because it is incredibly difficult to do it as a
Ralph Nader got on through a paid effort.
And you know what? I think very rarely is an all volunteer effort adequate.
Well, especially for big races.
Right.
It works pretty well on some of the smaller things like registrar of voters and some of the
municipal ones. It is not
that
bad.
That can be very easy.
But I think for the statewide offices, it's really tough.
But the thing is, we've gained and lost the ballot line for United States President and Vice President, United States Senate. We've gained and lost the line for governor. I think we once had the line for treasurer. We no longer have that.
I think in 2006 we petitioned and had a candidate on every line, and then some of our candidates received over 1% to maintain it, and some of our candidates didn't. And once again, those candidates that got on the ballot through petitioning were not invited to debates. People didn't know they were running.
When the debates are run by people like the League of Women Voters, They run a debate in the first congressional district annually, and I was invited to that as a candidate.
They try to be fair, although
Yes,
sometimes
they do.
have gotten overruled if they're working with a TV station.
Yeah.
But I do believe that when they run municipal or regional debates as well, everyone tends to be invited. But they care about having an informed electorate.
Yeah, and they stick to issues. You know, it's not just personalities and polling numbers. You know, it's not a horse race to these people. And you know, there again is an example of what one of the problems is with the way our system has devolved in recent years.
Now, before we talk about something else entirely, do you see any other big issues that the major parties don't want to talk about that it would take a Green or someone from a minor party to even bring up? And you know, for me, I think about a couple of things. I've been following the whole, BDS controversy, and you know, I'm Jewish. I lived in Israel. I don't buy from Israel right now. It's like, my own feeling is you don't help a country by helping them do stuff that's damaging to their citizens. And that is something that is very controversial among most of our elected leaders.
The pro-Israel lobby is one of the lobbies that has one hell of a lot of clout. And I look at the situation in Israel today, and I know that there have been Arab Israelis since there was an Israel in 1947. And those, for 3 generations, those Arab Israelis have fought in the Israeli armed forces. They've participated as full citizens. And now all of a sudden the current government of Israel has turned them into second-class citizens in their own country.
It's personally disturbing to me because the years I lived there, which was a very long time ago, 1969 to 74, everything was really wide open. It was all wide open. And I see what's happening now. And it's partly, I don't think that whole initiative even started on the ground there. I think it started by major powers using it as a pawn in bigger power plays. So anyway,
there's a hell of a misunderstanding about that issue here in the United States.
Well, the news is terrible. People should read Haaretz. My personal recommendation.
Yeah, one of the things that the Palestinians say when the Israeli tanks are about to roll over the border is the cousins are coming. And you know, this is one aspect that the United States missed, that a huge chunk of this conflict is a family squabble, and you have to address it as if you're talking to family members who aren't getting along. If we did that instead of using it as a surrogate power play for our dynamics with the old Soviet Union, or in this day and age, it's with China, and then maybe these problems would actually be solved.
Well, people, the people living there, at least some of them, must realize that it's such a small area. What affects one group will affect all groups there. You can't really close the door on it.
There's been a program run up in Maine for decades called Seeds of Peace. And they brought kids from Israel and Palestine to a camp in Maine and just had them get to know each other and get to listen to each other. And from what I hear, when there's a missile attack or an air raid, the first thing that happens, Israel and Palestine are on the same phone exchange. These kids who met in Maine and are now grown up, the first thing they do is pick up the phone, call their friend on the other side of the wall, and say, "Are you all right?" Yeah. And
what a way to grow up, huh?
Yeah, and the thing is that this is something I mentioned earlier. It's become systemic in the way responses are made. Nobody goes in looking for a solution. Everybody seems to be going in looking to dominate the situation.
Yeah.
The Israeli government doesn't want peace. It wants to dominate.
Yeah.
You know, the factions of the Palestinians don't want peace. They want to dominate. You know, that never solves anything. It doesn't solve anything in Israel and Palestine. It doesn't solve anything in the United States Senate. You know, it doesn't even solve anything in a Green Party meeting.
It just is not the way to go.
It is the best way to sabotage
Anything.
solution finding.
Now, we don't have a lot of time. We're not in too much of a hurry, but I wanted to bring up that I think the U.S. Senate, I'm glad you're on the show tonight, because the U.S. Senate has been in the news over the last week or two in an unprecedented way. I mean, I don't remember the last time really that
and
the
certainly
Senate
not a good way.
was in the spotlight the way it has been over the past week or so, and yes, and not in a good way. So, as a candidate for the Senate, what looks like the problem and what looks like it might help solve things?
There is a quote from Dwight David Eisenhower from a speech he gave in 1956 that's floating around the web today, and I don't have it memorized, but it was something along the lines that a political party that forgets to or is not oriented to something that is for the good of the people they represent isn't a political party anymore. It's a conspiracy to grab power. And unfortunately, that's what I saw in the United States Senate. Again, it's don't solve problems, dominate the situation.
And the vote was so party line. I mean, 98% party line. It's like people thinking for themselves at all.
And there were so many things that indicated that that Brett Kavanaugh was not suited for the Supreme Court. And what happens if he wasn't confirmed? Well, he goes back to being on the circuit court. It's no big deal. But these Republicans, were talking like, oh, it would ruin his life if we voted against him. I mean, excuse me, Susan Collins, are you sane? It would not ruin his life.
And I'm guessing, I know I have, I'm sure you have, and most of the viewers have at times gone to job interviews and not gotten the job. And you know what?
Almost every job interview I've gone to.
And it's not something that necessarily ruins your life. It would be over dramatic to say, if I don't get this one high level job, my life is ruined. And yet it came off that way. And when you looked at the vote, there was one Democrat who voted with the Republicans and one Republican who voted president.
Yeah.
So she kind of hedged her bets.
Well, she's from Alaska, and apparently the opposition to Brett Kavanaugh was pretty strong in Alaska. And the excuse that this guy from West Virginia gave or the excuse that's given for this guy in West Virginia is that he comes from a very red state and he might not have been able to get away with voting against Kavanaugh. But to me, that's dereliction of duty. The Constitution says, and I have a copy right here in your pocket if you want me to quote it, that it is the responsibility of the Senate to advise and consent. And I didn't see any questioning along the lines of, things that were relevant to his suitability as a Supreme Court justice. I didn't see any of that. I saw the partisan bickering. I mean, Lindsey Graham's tirade was pathetic.
I must admit I didn't listen to it. I heard about it.
Well,
it's actually disheartening to see the level of dialogue that was occurring.
As a survivor of sexual assault myself, I did not want to watch Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony, and I didn't. But I was in a room where the television was on when Kavanaugh was responding to it, and if anything disqualifies someone as a federal judge, his performance in front of a Senate committee did. His, his response to the questioner who asked, "Have you ever passed out from alcohol?" When he said, "Have you?" That was totally inappropriate in that setting. It, it's part of a bogus mind game that convinced me that I don't want this guy on the bench, any bench, not even a park bench if I'm in the park.
Well, I'm afraid we are going to see him.
Yeah.
We don't have very much time, maybe 2 minutes. Oh, we've got a little more than that. Good. But I wanted to mention to people that on this year's ballot, the names will shift a little from town to town, but everyone in the state will have 2 constitutional questions. One about keeping transportation revenues in a lockbox to be spent only for transportation projects, and the second to solidify a procedure that includes public hearings for selling public land. So do you want to speak a little bit to those?
I'm generally not in favor of lock boxes, but if you're going to take a fund that is earmarked for something, I think you need to have a higher standard than just, oh, we're not using that here. Let's move it over there. No, I think you should have, if not a compelling reason, at least a substantial reason to take it away from something that is clearly in the public good, like public education, which all our lottery revenue originally was supposed to go to.
I think some of our casino revenue was supposed to go to that
absolutely.
too.
That's part of the gambling revenue.
Yeah, and that.
And transportation is of course a very important aspect of this state. I mean, you can't hold down a job without a car in most of the places in Connecticut. So improving our transportation, making it green friendly, that's a very beneficial thing to the society in general. So I think, yes, we should have a higher standard. As far as making it impossible, well, that's never the case anyway, because they always find a way around it. Now, as far as the procedures to sell public land, I am all in favor of that. Again, because I believe there should be a much higher standard met when you sell something that belongs to we, the people of Connecticut, other than a legislature who thinks that, oh, this is a good idea. Well, maybe it's a good idea today, but it may be a really stupid idea 10 years down the road. And without this kind of protection for the property of we, the people, you can get a situation, well, similar to one we had in Glastonbury, where a farm that had been turned into a golf course in the 1950s was up for sale, and the overwhelming majority of people in town wanted to purchase the land for open space. And 3 people on our Board of Finance vetoed the idea. Wouldn't even allow it to come to 5 people. It was a 5-people board. I may have that wrong. But they vetoed the idea of putting up a referendum for us to decide democratically whether or not we wanted to spend the money to keep this open space. And within a year, 3 of the 5 people on that board were no longer living in town. So not only was it non-democratic, it was people who weren't even, weren't even in town by the time that the bulldozers started coming in and the foundation started to be dug.
Yeah, the population of Connecticut hasn't really risen, has gone down in general since the 1950s and 60s.
Certainly in proportion to the rest of the country.
Yeah, and you know, I see that when I see open space turned into housing developments, I cringe. You know, there are so many old places where there's a potential for infill development, for adaptive reuse.
And it's also an insane allocation of resources. One of the things that the neoliberal economists, who are almost entirely liberal, conservative Republicans, keep hammering on is that the unregulated free market is the most efficient way to allocate resources. And I have never, ever seen one iota of objective evidence to support that.
And actually our tendency to subsidize damage they do makes it even worse.
Even worse. I mean, one example is, if you take a trip out west, you'll go by these huge pens that you see 1 or 2 cows in. And they say, oh, this is great cattle country. You only need 15 acres to support 1 cow. You know how much land you need to support 1 cow in Connecticut? You don't measure how many cows you can have in Connecticut in acres per cow. You measure in cows per acre. If you can't support 3 cows on 1 acre of land in Connecticut, you do something else with it. We are 45 times more productive than good cattle country out west, and yet we can't maintain agriculture in this town when we have some of the most productive agricultural soil and conditions in the world.
Well, okay, so now we really are out of time.
I've had my rant.
Yes. Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Jeff.
Thank you, Ronna. It was good to be back.
And over the next 2 weeks, we will be having candidates who are running for Registrar of Voters in their respective towns. And it's not a big position in some ways, but in terms of our election system.
They are the people who count those signatures that have...
Right, and who run our elections and are responsible for election integrity. So it's really
counting write-in
important.
votes that often did not get counted, contrary to Connecticut state law.
So we'll be continuing on this this run of having Green Party candidates, and if every ballot is like the one in Union, the Green Party will be A, B, C, E, line F on your ballot come November 6th. So we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks, Ronna.
It's all
Africa, we know Africa, yo. Africa.